So these past few weeks, it looks like Sony's been pushing to get PlayStation 2 digital re-releases on the PS4. That's awesome. It's good to see old games get new love with 1080p and trophy support. A few weeks ago, it looks like Grand Theft Auto, the whole trilogy on the PlayStation 2, got pushed onto the store. But it looks like with the most recent update, Ark the Lad's the newest to be added. Honestly, this is sweet. It'll only be a matter of time before we get to see classics like Metal Gear or any of the Shin Megami Tensei's getting added to the list. Hopefully soon. However, I do have a few reservations on how Sony is handling PlayStation 2 games being played on the PS4.
At this point, I would like to point out that I do have some biases towards Sony. I do own a PlayStation 3, a PlayStation 4, a Vita, and a good variety of PS2 games. I'd like to see Sony come out on top on the console war for this generation between it and the Xbox. That being said, let's get this out of the way early too. I know many out there would say, "But Matt, why don't you plug in an old system and play them?" My answer to that is, tube TVs are getting harder and harder to come by, and in working condition too. If you play older systems on newer TVs, it's way easier to notice that the colors look washed out, and overall, it looks like shit seeing it on higher resolutions. So why does this happen? Because older component cables for older TVs weren't designed to play games over a certain resolution. Plus a lot of newer TVs don't have the old RGB or RF plug-in spots. It's all HDMI, all the way, baby. Now, as most of us know, when the PlayStation 3 first came out, it had backwards compatibility for PlayStation 2 games. It wasn't perfect by any stretch, but seen as lots of people had issues, but it worked. Now, for the PS3 to get it to work in the first place was an achievement on its own since it had a different architecture altogether. Now, the sole reason why Sony dropped its backwards compatibility in the first place wasn't for its issues, but rather more for money. Around the same time, Sony was experimenting with the PlayStation Store and its downloadable games. Sure, it had a few indie games here and there and a few full titles like Wipeout or Pain. Oh my god, Pain. Ugh. If there ever was a buyer's remorse, it would be for Pain. Now coming back towards backwards compatibility, Sony's first PlayStation 1 game to be released on the PSN Store was Final Fantasy VII. I remember back at their E3 press conference, Sony dropped a huge bombshell by saying that players could download the timeless classic for $10. Not to mention with the same purchase, you could also install it onto your PlayStation Portable as well. But back then, that was huge. That was a first. Since then, the PSN Store has been getting a steady release schedule of PlayStation 1 games. However, the library was still limited compared to what the physical library had to offer. Then a few years later, Sony dabbled in releasing PS2 titles for the PS3 to play digitally. This was a fantastic move, since a lot of great games like Shin Megami Tensei Digital Devil Saga, Persona, Odin Sphere, and even God Hand got its well-deserved re-releases. It didn't have any trophy support, but that was good enough to relive the classics. Now, to turn things into a technical perspective, the PlayStation 3 had something called the Cell microprocessor. Without going too far into detail, it was at the time a very powerful processor, but in the early days of the PS3's lifespan, it was an absolute bitch to program with, since it was new territory in hardware. To give a clear example of this, compare games like the first Uncharted game, Drake's Fortune, to the third Uncharted game, Drake's Deception, and you can easily tell the games clearly got better looking and ran a lot better, as the developers became more comfortable with how to work with the Cell processor. An accurate comparison to the hardware being a nightmare to work with would be the Sega Saturn. Without going too deep in the gore of it, the developers hated working with the hardware the Saturn had to offer. Why do you think there's no good Sega Saturn emulators to this very day? Okay, bringing it back to the PlayStation 4, when Sony was working on the technical specifications of the system, they wanted to make it easy as possible for PC games to be ported to the PlayStation 4. This was a very smart decision since it gave indie developers an easier time to bring their game to the console since it was built more like a PC in terms of architecture, thus opening new roads for console gaming as a whole. Moreover, since the PS4 runs more like a computer, it would be laughably easy for Sony to put out an emulator. Hell, the PC community's been doing PlayStation emulation for years now. The PS1 has been perfect in emulating. It offers so many settings to tinker with and looks fantastic on 4K resolutions. On the other hand, the PS2 emulator isn't anywhere near as perfect, but it still works. I don't endorse pirating games, but this emulator allows me to pop in my PS2 CDs and run them since my PS3 or PS4 is unable to. Opportunity missed, Sony.
So now that the history lesson's over, why can't we get to play good old PlayStation 2 games on our PlayStation 4?
The answer to this is quite simple. Money. The reason to remove backwards compatibility from the PlayStation 3 was strictly a business decision. Since it was competing with their PSN stores selling digital copies. Since it was confirmed that Sony was playing with PS2 games being playable on the PS4, everyone was excited, myself included. However, it got my suspicions aroused when I first heard the news. Now let me explain something. Did you ever wonder why all the PS1 and PS2 games never got released on the digital library on the PS3? The sinister reason behind it was lawyers and owners to the copyrights and licensing. When you want to publish someone else's work for sale on your platform, you need to go to the owner of the property or the publisher. Now, as many of you know, many studios have been closed or absorbed into new studios, or in EA's case, bought the studio and ran them straight into the ground.
Rest in peace, Maxis, Pandemic, Westwood Studios. You guys will certainly be missed.
In other cases, the publisher just goes bankrupt and all the IPs by the publisher go on sale or dissolve into obscurity since nobody bought the license. Case in point would be THQ when the publisher went tits up in December 2012 and it had to sell off all of its licenses to the highest bidder. For those who are unfamiliar with THQ and their catalog, their most recent works are Warhammer, Homefront, Red Faction, and even an Evil Dead game. As for their older stuff on the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2, they published a bunch of wrestling games and a lot of racing games.
By now you guys should be able to see where I'm going with this.
Since a lot of studios and publishers have gone either tits up or have been absorbed into something else, Sony can't exactly get the rights or the permissions required to digitally post a game on their store. So a lot of good games will go forgotten. However, there is a way around this problem. If Sony allowed the PlayStation 4 to run licensed discs from the PS1 and PS2 era natively on the PlayStation 4, it would bypass all those little legalities, but the way Sony has been going with business decisions, survey says that won't happen. Now, allowing backwards compatibility would be a tough bullet for a business like Sony to bite. Ultimately, it would compete with their digital re-releases on the store and would count as a lost sale since there are so very many PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 discs out there collecting dust and waiting to be used. That being said, I think Sony should allow backwards compatibility to those who desire it and still go forward with digital re-releases. Sure, they can't test all the games to work properly, but the gesture would be most welcome. But hey, Sony is a business first, and as a business, its bottom line is to make money. We as consumers can't forget that. To summarize everything, Sony would hands down win the console generation if they allowed PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 backwards compatibility. It would say to their loyal customers, "Hey asshole, thanks for buying our games for years and years. To reward you, we're letting you have the option to use those old discs in your closet to work with our new hardware."
Personally, I think the best solution would be a couple of ideas that I have. First, people who have already digitally purchased PlayStation 2 games to play on the PS3 should have crossed by, or at the very least reduced the full price up to $5. Because nobody likes rebuying the same thing over and over again. At least cut them a little bit of slack. And second, Sony should throw a patch out there that'll allow players just to insert their discs and just have fun. But hey, that's just my crafted opinion after all.
Hey, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. This is my second video that I've made, and my first one is off to the side there, of me unboxing the game Axiom Verge. If you want to check that out, give it a click. Also, for the rare days that I'm able to stream games, check out my Twitch channel where I stream Jackbox Party Pack and other fun games. As I don't have a lot of time to make these videos, I will be posting them when I can, and when it's done. But if you want to stick around and see what I do, feel free to give that subscribe button a click. It would mean a lot to me. Hope to see you guys in the next video.